Look. Dark Souls is for nerds. It's your no-hit runners, it's your 100,000-hour PvPers, it's your challenge runners beating the game in every possible way type players who truly worship Dark Souls as the pinnacle of all games. And this will oftentimes intimidate new players and push them away from trying the game, but as more Souls tangential games come out like Lies of P and Elden Ring, we have to answer the age-old question. Is it worth it for you to play Dark Souls? Lucky for you, I've done the work for you, because without having played any of the Dark Souls games before, I sat down in one stream that took over 9 days and beat every single Dark Souls game in one stream. And I've gathered the data, got the results, and I've got the answers to your questions. So, my breakdown and review of every single Dark Souls game to answer the question of if you should try Dark Souls. If you love Dark Souls 2, you're gonna hate me. Time to praise the sun, bitch.
You know what? All of you better duck, because I'm about to turn left, and I don't want to smack you with my dick.
I think the first step in appreciating Dark Souls 1, and particularly the remastered version, is just how much the art and the music carries the atmosphere in this game. I mean, look at this. And then listen to this. It's No Nut November, so I'm not going to play too much of that for you, but the art and the music of this game is awesome, and it really stands the test of time. There's so many areas in this game that, despite how frustrating they are, like Sen's Castle, are really captured and brought to life by the amazing different character design and music, and all sorts of attributes that contribute to the game's atmosphere. In terms of just creating a world, Dark Souls has done an amazing job. But creating a world doesn't also create a set of mechanics, so what about the actual gameplay of Dark Souls? In terms of the combat, Dark Souls creates a system that's extremely rewarding, although it has a very frustrating beginning phase of learning when you can attack, when you need to heal, how dodging works, how getting out of the way works. It feels like there's a million different things, and I'm oftentimes brought back to the Gargoyle boss fight to where you really understand the depth of combat in Dark Souls. But the reward you feel, that sweet victory at the end of hours and hours of grinding bosses, helps to remind you how insanely addictive the fighting system and subsequent reward is in Dark Souls. Let's fucking go! Oh my god, let's go! Oh my god! I think this is the highest praise you're going to get out of me in terms of the actual gameplay of the original Dark Souls. Because if we're relying on a game that claims to be extremely difficult, it expresses it in a lot of weird ways. I think there are a lot of ways that Dark Souls feigns difficulty that feels kind of scammy or otherwise really frustrating to interact with. For example, a lot of the menus literally don't tell you what certain attributes do, don't help you describe or understand items that you pick up all too well. Yeah, there's a lack of directions, which is fine because the game isn't trying to hold your hand, but then why make the runs to certain boss fights literal minutes long and hide essential bonfires? Yes, I'm looking at you, Nito and Sen's Castle. It's ridiculous that I have to do a 2-minute run to find out where Nito's base is in the first place, and the nearest bonfire is the distance of that run. Why do I have to do that every single time, try to learn boss fight patterns at the same time, and then run past hundreds of elite mobs and oftentimes die and otherwise become frustrated at the parts of the game that aren't even important? Or in Sen's, where one of the most important bonfires at the end of the castle run is by far one of the hardest to find, and then incorporating hundreds of different ways for you to die in the most bullshit areas. But these are things I can look past. Things I can't look past? I don't know, maybe when we put these 2 giant bow guards in Aaron Orlando near one of the longest runs in the entire game, that, mind you, does not even lead to a boss fight, so I'm supposed to go to another bonfire, but we just create the most unbearable, despicable, horrifyingly annoying, and just lame area in the game just to say that things are difficult. This is the crux of my problem with Dark Souls, because you'll find yourself in these places so many times where you're just asking yourself, what is the purpose of this? Why is this hard? Hard difficulty being enjoyable is found in fighting, in skill, in bosses, in things that you can increase your ability in, and it reflects in your gameplay. Things that are not fun, that are hard, making things intentionally confusing without having any explanation available anywhere, like stat menus or items, making areas impossibly long and winding, and having it be a standard to just run past things because it's clearly not worth your time to participate in the literal game itself. And I'm being very critical of Dark Souls 1, but for good reason, because when I initially completed the game, I was far harsher on it and thought it was much worse of a game. But after reflecting on my experience, I've realized that there's a lot of great components to Dark Souls 1. It's those little spaces, though, the connectors, that are meant to bring fluidity to an experience that oftentimes fall, maybe as a result of the time gap, or maybe as a result of the game design itself, or what the developers were intending in creating Dark Souls, that hold it back from being a really great experience. With this being said, the game is really fun, and I understand why it's a cult classic and has a fan base that is so rabid, and I can't be too harsh on it despite a lot of its shortcomings. 6 out of 10.
Now you sure it's him?
Gohan, once you've had a man inside of you, you know when he's coming.
Dark Souls 2 is the worst game I've ever played. That's it, we can move. I have one kind thing to say about this game before I get to absolutely eviscerating everything about this game. I appreciate the travel mechanic in Dark Souls 2 and how it sequentially orders all the different areas, and that the narrative in Dark Souls 2 and the actual story is extremely linear. It makes it easy to follow in a game that's relatively convoluted. There, I've been kind. I'm no longer going to be kind. Everything about this game sucks. The combat is so unbelievably slow. It's not fun, like everything just feels so like weird and delayed. Something I'll have more complaints about with later games, but like, let's start with the art and the music. Although the music is generally really good in all these games, the art in Dark Souls 2 is just so flat and lifeless. I don't know how to explain this phenomenon, but everything just feels so soulless, like it's just mobs that were created as archetypes of the areas that they're in rather than own entities that absorb the atmosphere and really bring the game to life. And I really think the worst example of this is how quickly bosses in the game will become mobs and otherwise be used separately as reskins. This happens in Dark Souls 1, but not at the frequency that it does in Dark Souls 2. And the amount of unique mobs that I actually stopped at and said wow towards, or was really impressed by, is basically not. Speaking of things being not, the healing system does not exist for like your first 6 hours of the playthrough. You have to find the Estus flasks, which is fine because this is a feature from Dark Souls 1, but you start with one Estus flask, and then they have these weird healing shards that are like probably the worst addition to the game altogether as a gimmick. Yeah, they're cool, I guess, but they really don't add anything to the source of combat, and if anything, it takes a combat system that's already extremely slow and then adds a slow healing mechanic, which by way of being slow forces you to play fights even slower in a game that already has a gruelingly slow combat speed. Speaking of that change, Dark Souls 2 has decided to take the creative liberty in adding additions to the game that make the experience so much more enjoyable and understandable for the player. Let's start with the invincibility frames and your roll being directly influenced by a stat in the game. Who thought this was a good idea? Show them to me. This is a mechanic where there's no real purpose in altering with it other than just to fuck with the player. Like, oh, they already understood from Dark Souls 1 how fundamentally sound rolling is in combat. Let's just completely alter the way it interacts and have arbitrary value numbers on the stats where you can only figure out which numbers are the correct ones that give you correct invincibility frames unless you look it up yourself. Yeah. I don't know either. Another thing Dark Souls 2 took the liberty of adding that absolutely nobody asked for was making it so that every time you die, your health bar gets shorter. So sympathize with me for a second, the people who love Dark Souls 2. As someone who hates Dark Souls 2, I'd like to ask you a question. Do you like any of the changes we just talked about? Because I can tell you a change that is just indefensible. I've already expressed the complaint in Dark Souls 1 about there being way too many mobs in areas that simply don't need them. So why is every square inch of Dark Souls 2 covered with unbelievably annoying mobs? Everywhere. For no reason. Have you guys played the Fire Knight section of Dark Souls 2? Have you? No, seriously. Have you played this section? Do you understand what this feels like? Noxious fucking section. Oh my fucking god, man. I went on my own time, grinded an entire separate storyline to get infinite poison arrows just to make getting through this section bearable. For a boss that's completely forgettable and reskinned like 4 hours later into the playthrough. What is the fucking point? I'll tell you what the point is. There is none. Which, side note, this could be a consequence of me playing the Scholar of the Second Sin edition of Dark Souls 2, but why even release a version of the game where this is a thing? But honestly, I could forgive all of this about Dark Souls 2. All of it. I could forgive all of it if the game wasn't such a fucking bore. I feel like Quagmire in that one scene of Family Guy where he's just telling Brian that he's just the worst human being ever.
But you know what? I could forgive all of that, all of it, if you weren't such a bore. That's the worst of it, Brian. You're just a big, sad, alcoholic bore. I'll see you, Brian. Thanks for the steak.
But it really is true. This game is just so forgettable. Like, I can't think of one area, one unique interaction, one boss fight, other than maybe the Knight's Carriage fight, where I sat and I was like, wow, this is really cool. I like this interaction. Literally nothing. Everything is so forgettable. It's so washed. It honestly feels like you took Dark Souls 1 and just watered it down to like its bare essentials and just filled it with a bunch of glue and feathers and stuck a bunch of shit to it to see if it would work, and none of it really did. 1 out of 10. 0 out of 10. And I know I'm gonna get a lot of hate for this section because there's a ton of people who love Dark Souls 2, so please, if you're one of those people, state your case in the comments. I will read it and I'll let you know my thoughts. But something you're definitely gonna want to hear my thoughts on is Dark Souls 3.
Oh, shit.
Hell's grenade!
Oh man, it's even got a cool name.
Is Dark Souls 3 the best game ever? Probably not. Is it close? Nah. I genuinely get giddy thinking about Dark Souls 3. You see, I didn't go into this challenge or playing any of these games with the intention of anything. I just was kind of playing them to play them. I'd never played them before. It seems like every gamer who plays games has played them, so it only makes sense that I would try them. And I come away just blown away by Dark Souls 3. Let's just start with the environment building in this game. In the Dark Souls 2 section of this video, I was super critical of the game being very bland and flat, and the mobs not bringing to life the different sections in the game. But Dark Souls 3 is the exact opposite of this. Every single section, even the grayest, darkest, most vile areas that would oftentimes fall victim to this problem, have so much life and horror and everything brought into them, from the mobs to the way that stepping on water sounds or walking through the caverns and the different things that you just run into all build the world incredibly. And there's no greater example of this weird catacomb dungeon area in the game, of which I personally enjoyed the least. This is probably my least favorite section, just sheer gameplay wise, because of how many annoying mobs there are and the confusing directions of the area. But the environment is insane. Everything is so creepy. It's crawly. There's cages with skeletons and they're trying to grab you, and there are these mother witches who are casting these insane spells, giant rats, bone plague diseases, everything. Giant freaking basement troll that flies over his enormous arm on top of this already dilapidated and broken down castle. I mean, for a section that I do not like, I only have amazing things to say for the art, the sounds, everything. Speaking of those sounds, holy shit, the OSTs in Dark Souls 3 are unreal. I could rave about this section forever, but instead of doing that, why don't we just reference how much I love Gwyn's theme from Dark Souls 1, and then listen to what they did in the final boss fight. Oh, but the change in the soundtrack is so sick. This is heaven. This is literally heaven. I mean, the final boss fight of this game is already unbelievably awesome. 2 phases about all of the Lords of Ember. Like, it's so cool, right? But then you're just greeted with the most angelic, holy OST ever. And there's a bunch of other boss OSTs in this game that are just phenomenal. All the music and sound is amazing as well, and it really captures the essence of the game. Speaking of the music that goes along with those aforementioned bosses, let's talk about them because this game has so many cool bosses. In Dark Souls 1 and 2, it often felt like the beginning bosses were forgettable, and in the case of Dark Souls 2, all of them were forgettable, but nothing captivated me more like the cursed rotted Greatwood in Dark Souls 3. Like, how sick is this boss? The giant farmer mob on the bottom with all of its sweet spots in the area, and it's just freaking enormous. Like, I oftentimes will have problems with the camera controls in these games, and this will be a later criticism I have of Dark Souls 3, but just the space that these bosses take up and their presence. And then when you fall through the fucking floor, it's so cool. And then we have the Abyssal Watchers, who take a really cool mechanic of the bosses being able to fight themselves and does a two-phase boss fight without being redundant by utilizing moves that are actually in the first boss's movesets, but adds different adaptations to them, makes the fight even cooler. The OST gets crazier, like, oh, it's such a good fight. It's so good. As someone who literally spent over 5-6 hours on the Abyssal Watchers, I still come away from it thinking this boss is sick. Or Pontiff, who is literally in my favorite bosses of the entire series top 3, undoubtedly. Coolest aesthetic of his swords being different types and him cloning himself. Like, the Pontiff boss fight and the attacks, and it's so good, 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 it's so good. I could rave about the bosses forever, but what matters the most in these boss fights is the actual combat system. And Dark Souls 3 nails it. Dark Souls 3 is so fast. Everything is so intense. It just condenses all the combat and the flaws of Dark Souls 1 and 2 and really brings everything together. The invincibility frames on rolling feels really good. Healing feels great. There's much slimmer opportunities to attack in this game because everything's so fast. But the combat system in Dark Souls 3 has an attribute to it that is just simply unexplainable. It's so fluid, it's like you're dancing. And Dark Souls 3 for sure has its moments where it shows it's Dark Souls 2 and 1, but they're oftentimes few and far in between. The only major complaints I'd have about the game are that the camera control kinda doesn't compensate for how fast the game plays. And there's obviously some sections where there's just an insane amount of mobs, but Dark Souls, right? But unlike the other Dark Souls games, Dark Souls 3 has a lot of bonfires, and it lets you teleport right away, virtually fixing all the major problems I have with the progression of the non-boss areas in a Dark Souls game. Combine that with some unforgettable scenery, music, gameplay qualities, and customization that is far greater than any of the other games. I mean, come on, what's not to love? I think Dark Souls 3 really encapsulates the difficult nature of what a Dark Souls game is supposed to be without overindulging in this gimmick and simultaneously making a really fun RPG game where you feel like you're building a character rather than playing a trope of a game inside the body of some protagonist. And to top it all off, the Firekeeper is so dreamy. 9 out of 10. 9.5 out of 10. 9.9999999. 10 out of 10.
Gohan, what was that? It's French, Dad. Specifically my household, but it's really awkwardly...
And there you have it. Every Souls game rated. TLDR, definitely play Dark Souls 3. Maybe play Dark Souls 1. Do not play Dark Souls 2 ever in your life. But with that said, hey, look, I'm Samikid. I do hard gaming challenges, and this was one of them. I do a bunch of other ones, just like this one, where I did the God Gamer Gauntlet and beat Ludwig's time. I also beat every FNAF game on the hardest difficulty in one stream, and we got a lot more content coming. So if you enjoy what I do over here, maybe subscribe. It's free and helps me out a lot. Like the video if you hate Dark Souls 2, otherwise I hate you, and hey, I'll see you soon. Bye.